Good. Our lecture today is coming from Rachel Mander, and her title is Creation Care and the Gospel. Our speaker works for A Rocha International as their Strategy Development Officer. She has previously worked for Faith for the Climate, Hope for the Future, and for Sir Stephen Timms, MP. Last year, she was lead organizer of the Young Christian Climate Networks Relay at COP26, a network she founded. She lives in Hillsborough, Sheffield. And with that, Rachel, we look forward to hearing from you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for all of you who are here. It's lovely to be with you this afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen from which I'll present, and I'll be speaking for about 35 minutes, and then I would love your questions. And feel free, if you're joining this lecture on Zoom, feel free to put questions in the chat. I will not address them as I'm speaking, but there'll be time for that at the end. And yes, my title is Creation Care and the Gospel, and the subheading for this is Hope which is not escapist. So if you take anything from this, just remember that one line and I'll be happy with that. So I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction both to myself and A Rocha, where I work, and then I'll take you through creation care in the biblical narrative. We'll talk then about what does this mean in our current context, touching on grief and lament and hope and what that means. And I'll talk a little bit about the language that we use when we're talking about this subject, and in particular stewardship and creation care. And we'll talk very briefly about what next. And that might also be a feature of our questions and discussion afterwards as well. So by way of introduction, I grew up in Birmingham in the UK, and for the first 18 years of my life, I did not know about or care about creation care and the gospel. I then went and studied a philosophy degree, and a couple of things happened. Firstly, I was studying political philosophy, and there was a section that was about climate change, which I found deeply unsatisfactory and therefore made me think about the subject a lot more. And then also while I was there, I was at a church where there were, I had friends who saw that their faith meant that they obviously cared about the environment. And to me at that time, that wasn't obvious. But because of my friendship with them, it made me examine scripture more thoroughly, and then think about it more as well. And then that's led me to what I'm doing today. After I graduated, I worked in London for a year, and I was around Parliament at the 10-year anniversary of the Climate Change Act in the UK, but I was also in London during the establishment of the Extinction Rebellion, and was starting to get involved in some of the activism that was happening beyond the walls of Parliament. Then moved to Sheffield, where I am now. I now work full-time for A Rocha, and as was mentioned, I've been involved in the Young Christian Climate Network. So that's a little bit of background. A Rocha was established in 1983. It started in Portugal. The name A Rocha means the rock, and it took the form of a field study centre on the Alval coast. Now, A Rocha works in more than 20 countries, doing conservation work around the world in a whole variety of forms, and I work for their international team. So, creation in the biblical narrative. This is quite an ambitious section of the lecture, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to structure what I'm talking about around the three trees, what I mean by the three trees is the tree of knowledge in Genesis, the tree that Jesus is crucified upon, and the tree of life, the one in Revelation, where it says that the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So we'll take those three trees and kind of walk through the biblical narrative in a way that will only ever give us an overview, but it will give us an overview to kind of work with and think about as I'm talking beyond those things as well. So we'll start at the beginning. We'll start at creation. And Genesis begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I want to start with that verse because sometimes I think it is forgotten that God also created the heavens. We're very happy with the idea of a created earth, but God also created the heavens. And that becomes important when we're thinking about the third tree and the new creation as well. Genesis starts with two creation accounts in the first and second chapters of Genesis. And there are some verses in Genesis that are responsible for quite a negative view of Christian theology in relation to the wider creation. And probably principal upon those is a verse from Genesis 1:28 that says, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And you can see from the verbs that I've underlined where we might be headed with that. We've had a view that rather than being part of creation, humans have been set apart from creation, and that we are gifted the wider creation to do with as we please, because we somehow rule over the rest of wider creation. However, this is not the be all and end all. Then in the next chapter, we've got an account that gives some nuance and some extra detail to that first chapter. And Genesis 2:15 says this, "Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it." And the use of tend here means to work and serve. And in the context of a garden, it's talking about cultivation. And you can see that in the King James version of this verse, this verb is translated as dress. And dress has a really nice nuance of adornment and embellishment and improvement. And that is why I have added a picture of some bunting to the slide, because to me, bunting speaks to improvement and embellishment and adornment. And that is a very different emphasis to the sort of ruling and hierarchy that is sometimes kind of conceived of in talking about the Genesis and creation accounts. So what we have when we're thinking about Adam and Eve is not this picture of them ruling and being gifted the wider creation. Instead, they are part of a community of creation that God creates, to which they belong, and their role within that community of creation is as gardeners or cultivators or caretakers. They are there to work and serve and keep and dress all the wider creation. And this is an important starting off point as well, because when we think about the narrative that we have within Genesis, we often think of it in terms of the relationship that Adam and Eve have with God, who at that point walks in the garden with them, and then their subsequent rejection of God and expulsion from the garden. And I just wanted to flag that in their expulsion from the garden, that's signifying that their brokenness and alienation is not just a brokenness and alienation from God, it's also a brokenness and alienation from wider creation and the land. And the land itself is also affected by the fall. So there's a relationship that doesn't even involve Adam and Eve, that is just between God and what he has made. And Genesis 3 talks about cursed is the ground. And that is the fracturing of the way that God relates to the earth, not involving humans. So you've got a fracturing of three sets of relationships between God and humanity, humanity and the earth, and God and the earth. And all of that is part of this first tree. The other thing to say is that often picked up in this idea of humans ruling is the idea is that we are made in the image of God. And even if we're going to go down that route of talking about the way that we're made in the image of God, it's important to really examine what that would mean if that was going to have implications for how we treated the rest of wider creation. And I really like this quote from Jonathan New. He says, our rule as God's image bearers finds its model in the self-sacrificial love of God displayed in Christ. So if we are looking to think about what the image of God means, then we look to God personified for us in Jesus, and then that should inform the way that we think about this, which will lead us nicely on to the second tree. So we've spoken about creation, we've spoken about a vocation that's entrusted to Adam and Eve to be gardeners. We've spoken about the fracturing not just of humans' relationship with God, but also the wider creation. And then we are coming to the Gospels and the account of Jesus's death and resurrection. The first thing is that as we consider what is the gospel and what is the significance of Jesus's crucifixion, we read this in Colossians 1, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on heaven or things on earth, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So often when we're thinking about accepting that Jesus Christ is Lord, we think about doing that as a kind of personal proclamation of the gospel, but actually in making a proclamation that Jesus Christ is Lord, we are saying something about what Jesus Christ is Lord over, and that's not just I'm proclaiming that for my personal self. I'm saying Jesus Christ is Lord over creation. That's all of heaven and all of earth, and therefore the gospel has a cosmic scope from as Jesus created all things within creation. The reconciliation of all things is the claim of the gospel. So it's much more expansive than is sometimes thought about, and it brings the earth into the claim of redemption, whereas sometimes we are thinking so much in anthropocentric terms about our relationship with God, that we think of the gospel also in anthropocentric terms, in terms of Christ's redemption of humanity as opposed to the wider creation. And this passage on the supremacy of Christ speaks into that and reminds us of that context. In the gospel account of John, we find that John parallels that Genesis account. You might be familiar with this just from the first verse of John's gospel, where it talks about in the beginning was the word. But in John chapter 20, John does a very similar thing when he's recounting Mary's encounter with Jesus at the tomb. She mistakes him as a gardener. And this is not just, foolishness on Mary's part. It's actually a poetic hint about something, a much bigger claim. So if we think that Jesus is the last Adam, and the first Adam was a gardener, Jesus is the last Adam is also a gardener. He's the fulfillment of that vocation that is given from the beginning. We see here in this painting a depiction of Jesus as gardener, and there is a variety of artwork on the next slide as well that depicts the same thing. We see in this painting that Jesus is wielding a scythe, which we might most associate with the Grim Reaper, but is associated with Jesus to the extent that Jesus is Lord of the harvest, something that is picked up on in Matthew 3 and 13 and Revelation 14. Jesus is Lord of the harvest. And we see as well Mary in this painting is bowing in, and there's like an outline around her that's in the shape of a kernel of wheat, which reminds us me of the psalm about sowing in tears and reaping in shouts of joy. So I think it's a really beautiful painting. And there is a variety of other art that picks up on the theme of Jesus as a gardener who is calling us as his disciples to also be gardeners and return to that first vocation that is given to humanity. I think my personal favourite is in the top left. It's Polish Jesus wearing some dungarees. I think it's a very excellent artwork. And I would encourage you that if you're not familiar with some of these paintings, to have a bit of an investigation and Google as to what's out there, and read some of the background and context to those depictions and why they're shown in the ways that they are. So that leads us towards the final tree, the new creation. I don't know whether you have sung the following line before, but it's from the hymn Amazing Grace. There's an older verse in it that disappeared for a while and then came back, where it's often sung that earth shall soon dissolve like snow. And this is, from my perspective, unfortunate aspect of a kind of wider soft Christian culture, where we talk a lot about heaven and without really expanding what we mean by heaven, and it often means getting rid of earth, and it often means a heaven that is quite disembodied and immaterial, and part of what we've done here is to forget that the model that we have in Jesus is one of bodily resurrection. When we read about or think about the concept of spirit, which the Hebrew is ruach, which means like breath, or it's like a quality or like animation of lifefulness. We've often interpreted that in a slightly more Platonic way, where we think about it as a substance, and then thinking about it as a substance leads us to think that an idea of spirit is separate to body, and then you kind of get these kind of body soul composites, which are not really part of the kind of scripture and the image that we get from like an older tradition, and then that influences how we think in terms of a coming redemption, because we think in terms of, well, if the spirit is something that is more immaterial and separate to the body, well, when we have bodily death, then what we do is we release an immaterial spirit, and then that leads us into a kind of abstract thinking about a disembodied heaven and earth. There's an author called Brian Matson, and Brian Matson says that the best stories fulfill whatever had potential at the beginning. And I think if we apply that to this biblical narrative, then what we see that is that the promise of redemption fulfills all the kind of plot points that were present at the beginning. And rather than just do away and have like a disjunction between creation and the new creation, we have something that fulfills the potential of creation in the beginning. So rather than a picture of the new creation, which is unhuman or disembodied, instead it becomes more human. So Jesus in his resurrected body is still a physical body, and the promise that we have in scripture is not of the earth dissolving like snow, but instead a restoration of heaven and earth, and the restoration of God being with people, but also place-based. If we were looking at all of those relationships at the beginning, between God and humanity and the earth and God, then the picture of restoration is the restoration of that entire community of creation as well. So that is a very kind of whistle-stop tour of creation in the biblical narrative. But the things to really pull out of that is to think that when we talk about the gospel and the good news, we are talking about good news in a broad, holistic sense. When we're not just narrowing that to human salvation, we are thinking in terms of the promise of redemption for brokenness, not just for humans, but the entire community of creation that God made. And so from that, we're going to move on and think a little bit about grief and lament and hope. Because if we are thinking about those three trees that I've just talked through, we are not at tree 3. We are somewhere between the second tree and the third tree, and the reality of brokenness and of death is a reality that we each know well and see in what is happening around us, and particularly thinking within the context of climate change, the biodiversity crisis, and many other things. We see that within our present. From a personal perspective, when I first kind of took my first small steps towards being part of what you might call the environmental movement, I really struggled with elements of people expressing their own grief and lament. And that was partly because from the perspective of my experience of faith at that point, I was very keen to emphasize the hope that we had to the detriment and exclusivity of anything else. And when I was part of some of the things happening within Extinction Rebellion, I saw very much a perspective that fit with that kind of biblical narrative. It said, wow, isn't creation precious and good? And wow, isn't it affected by our brokenness and greed? And goodness me, we should do something about that, and we should act in love to restore it. And I was like, oh, I can see some parallels that are happening. But I equally really struggled with, and there was a sign off from that Extinction Rebellion used. I don't actually know whether it's still in use currently, but they used to sign off emails, love and rage. And I felt like, oh, I can fully get behind the love. I'm not really sure about the rage. It feels aggressive and a bit unpleasant and unpalatable. And wouldn't it be easier if we just signed off love? Was how I was feeling. But I've journeyed since that point. And I now understand that actually rage is an appropriate response in the face of sustained injustice, because it recognizes the wrongness of the brokenness and death that we see. And that has been part then of opening me up and some of the experiences that I've had since that point. What I really wish right now is that you were listening to Hannah Malcolm, because Hannah Malcolm is writing a PhD on climate grief. Everything that she writes is fantastic. Everything that she ever says is also fantastic. And I would really encourage you to go and search her out after this. She has many blog posts that I think you should read. And she's also edited a collection called Words for a Dying World, which are stories of grief and courage from the global church. Lots of different voices talking about what it is that is being grieved over in this context at the moment. And I really like this quote that she says, that the Bible's apocalyptic literature taught her that we can't propose a hopeful future without first grieving our doomed present. And that has been something that I have learned. I wanted to share with you this, which I anticipate some people will find quite challenging. This comes from a webinar that was held in 2020. And the context for this was the Black Lives Matter movement had started. A church in the US had opened up a service of lament. And within that service, they invited contributions from young people, from people locally, etc. Within the contributions, somebody swore. And this did not make the people attending the service feel very comfortable or very happy. And there was a bit of a backlash then about the way that the service had been held. So then this webinar was held separate to the service. And this webinar was discussing both the emergence of that Black Lives Matter movement and what had happened within the context of that service, the role that Lament was playing there, and the controversy that had surrounded that contribution. In this webinar, this contribution was made from a man called Mander, who is also studying a PhD that I really one day hope to read. And he said, let me firstly introduce myself. My name is Mander from Tuvalu, a small island to the north of Fiji in the Pacific. It's not a question, it's just a comment to go along with what you've said, in line with what we've been saying about the underprivileged, especially coming from a low-lying country, a low-lying island, which is highly affected by climate change. And this is the response that I normally receive from the West when I tell them at conferences, church conferences, and so forth. we will remember Tuvalu in our prayers. I think it's about time that we should stand up and hold our hands together and have the courage to say to them, F your prayers, it's time to act now. Thank you very much. Now, you can imagine that this is quite a challenging contribution to bring to a webinar, but I'm sharing it here because I think this challenge is really important. What it's challenging is cheap hope. And I think it's really important that as we talk about the role of grief and lament, is to also talk about what it is that hope is and how does grief and lament sit alongside hope. So just keep this in mind as I talk through some of those other things and see how this intervention from Mander might be pointing towards a critique of cheap hope. So this is a quote that I really like. It's from David Atkinson. He says, "We need a theology that is more robust than the optimistic wish that everything will work out all right. A theology that may take us by way of Gethsemane and the cross before we reach Easter, by way of grief and mourning and repentant change before we celebrate hope." When I started my little baby steps towards the environmental movement, I was absolutely operating out of a point that equated hope with optimism. And if I had continued on that journey, it wouldn't have taken me very far. We need a theology that's more robust and is able to cope with the extent of brokenness that we see in a way that leads us through it and not just around it. So grief and lament. Grief, I'm just defining as an experience of loss. We all experience loss, and therefore we all experience grief in different forms. And lament is grieving the existence of loss in some ways. It's grieving the forms of death that we see around us. But it's also a practice of holding our pain before God. And in doing that, we're making an expression or confession of our faith, because we're confessing that both belief and loss exist together, and that they're part of the same reality. I think something that I often think about in relation to this is the story of Lazarus, because we see in that story that Jesus grieves and laments, and then Lazarus is raised from the dead. So that I think tells us something really interesting, because it says that there was a place for Jesus's grief and lament in a context in which he was very aware of what was to come and raising Lazarus from the death from death. So the question is, why? And I think the reason for why is because it points us towards the fact that actually lament is its own thing and has its own role as an expression and act of faith, and isn't in some way just inconvenient, but is part of bringing us into a fuller understanding of the richness and gifted nature of hope itself. So I want to talk a little bit about hope, partly because when I've spoken on this topic, hope always comes up, even if it's not in any way referenced as part of a talk. And often it's asked about, as I would term, cheap hope, because people ask about hope, and their meaning below that is, please can you tell me why this isn't as bad as I'm feeling right now? And it's someone wanting a little bit of reassurance. And often we can gravitate towards a cheap hope. And I was trying to quantify what I might mean by a hope that is cheap. And I think hope is cheap if it wants you to seek reassurance and comfort above everything else. If it wants to be able to affirm whatever the status quo is. If it is death denying, by which I mean it doesn't want to face the reality that death is present. And because it's death denying, it leads you to either avert your eyes or avoid or escape. So often in a kind of Christian term, cheap hope looks like yes, it would be better if the environment was not in the position it was in now, but don't worry about it, because we have certain hope in Jesus, and that stands firm regardless. So as you see environmental destruction gathering pace, close your eyes, don't think about it, just think about Jesus. As if that was a consistent thing to say, but never mind. But that's the kind of measure of whether hope is cheap. On the flip side of this, there's real hope. And real hope, instead of wanting you to seek reassurance and comfort, wants you to seek truth and Jesus. It is very happy to stare death in the face, and real hope will lead you towards the death and not away from it. Something that I think within Christian faith is incredibly powerful is that at the center of it, we have an act of remembrance of death. Eucharist should confront us with death. And we have verses like that of 2 Corinthians 4:10. We carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. Death is actually quite a taboo within many cultures, the English culture definitely so, and within the context that we are in environmentally, we will see an increase in the speed and the extent and the horror of death, and offering Christian hope means not circumventing that, but we accept that we see death and we acknowledge it and we name it. What we do, though, is reject the finality of death, but we are led towards it, not away from it. We have a hope that is not escapist, and that I think is really important. I want to tell you a story again that I think illustrates something of this for me. When in 2019, I went to a report about environmental breakdown, and they had a panel event to mark this report being launched. One of the panelists was Farhana Yamin. She was a lawyer for small island states within the COP process. And she was talking about some of her previous work, and she got quite emotional because she was kind of live processing with the audience the fact that she was really uncertain about the fact that she had worked in her career on a problem that had got exponentially worse, and she was kind of reckoning with the sense of loss that she had about whether she had put her efforts in the right place. Someone else who was also there at that panel also got really emotional and said in response to Farhana, he said, "Farhana, thank you so much for the work that you have done. And I want to say to you that no time is wasted." And it was an incredibly moving moment as part of this panel event, because a professional report launch setting is not necessarily the place that you expect for such human and warm exchanges. But I think something about that quote, "No time is wasted," speaks to real hope, because it is coming from a place of being in the midst of it, and within a kind of Christian hope or understanding. I think what we can say about what we work towards or think about within this context is that no love is wasted, and nothing done with God is wasted either. So even in the context where you feel like things are getting worse, and plausibly they very much are getting worse, there is something more certain to hold on to within that context. This leads on to thinking about stewardship and creation care as words that we use. And the reason I'm kind of raising these as words is because I'm not necessarily convinced that they're always the most helpful. They are, however, widely well understood and used at very high levels as well. Last year, in the joint statement on climate change by the Archbishop of Canterbury and Pope Francis and the Ecumenical Patriarch, they referenced stewardship, talking about climate change. The terms are not divisive, and the terms also imply long-term thinking, and they encourage an ethic of restraint, which is all positive. However, I'd like to just give some challenges or heads up to this sort of language. So firstly, this language of stewardship is not specific to the environment as it is used in the Bible at all. Stewardship is used as such a kind of pillar of Christian thinking on this topic. And I think that should be challenged because that's not using the Bible on its own terms, so to speak. If we think about stewardship, stewardship is for inanimate things, and the creation is not inanimate. There's an implication of hierarchy within the idea of stewardship, and often it kind of implies that humans are mediating or managing creation on behalf of God, which is slightly strange and also leaves no space for wilderness. So it leaves no space for creation to exist outside of that human management and have a direct relationship with God. And it's very human-centered. Creation on a kind of stewardship model is to be sustainably managed and often for our use, which is both kind of very instrumental, very like human-centered. I think we could have a more positive idea about creation than just sustainable management. And this leads to a personal suspicion of mine that these terms might be operating as cheap hope, because in some of the discussions that I've had with different people about stewardship or creation care, or like the application of them, often I find that the application of them affirms the status quo of how we treat creation at the moment. And people really struggle to define what abuse of creation is. And that is a problem, because if we can't agree or use these terms to define what would be an abuse of creation, then I suspect it's not going to help us very much with defining how we should treat creation in a way that will lead to its flourishing and thriving. So where does that leave us? I would love to see us live out a real hope. And that means returning to our gardening vocation. Part of that is thinking more of ourselves as gardeners or fellow creatures, embracing the fact that we are creaturely, as opposed to thinking of ourselves as rulers with all the answers, and with wider creation beneath our feet. It means facing death. I think, as we've seen with the pandemic, death is difficult for us theologically sometimes, and the pandemic led to a lot of different reactions within the church, but it's something that we need to think more carefully about as we go into the coming decades, and also practically as followers of Jesus, being people who are prepared to sow in tears and reap in joy, and be part of walking towards the death and not just around it or walking away from it. And then also being consistent with our claim that Jesus Christ is Lord. If we are proclaiming that Jesus Christ is Lord over all of creation, then our lives should be consistent with what Jesus's purposes for creation are. And so if our lives are ones that are complicit and make worse the destruction of creation, that does not, to me, witness that Jesus Christ is Lord of creation, wanting to reveal his glory through all he has made. I'm going to quote again from Hannah Malcolm and Jonathan Moo. Hannah Malcolm talks about the fact that Jesus did not instruct his disciples to save the world or condemn it to death, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about in the context of talking about hope and despair. Instead, we take up the call to compassion, healing, dignifying and defending those we encounter in anticipation of what God has already done and will do. Our context is unique, but the work of the church here and now is not. We have already been called to heal the sick, care for the dying, and pursue life in all its fullness, knowing that Jesus has already made things well again. We are both palliative nurse and midwife. Resurrection is coming. I really like how she holds those different images together. And I think it's a really good articulation of what real hope might look like as applied to the situation we are in environmentally and the death that it will bring with it, but also the suffering of people and the inequality and injustice of climate change. And then we have this quote from Jonathan New, which again, I think does similar. Jonathan says, "We are called to live as instantiations of the kingdom of God, members of a resistance movement against all that would destroy God's creation. Our lives, even now, ought to begin to be orientated towards creation in a way that is consistent with creation's eventual freedom from futility and ruin." Again, like thinking about consistency with what we're saying as Christians in proclaiming that Jesus Christ is Lord, and what it will means to witness to Jesus, witnessing to a kingdom in which the whole community of creation has space to flourish. I'm going to come into land here, so I hope that you are already thinking of some questions. And just as a way of like continuing this conversation, or if you want to read further, there's a free digital resource which I've written, which is called Redeeming All Things, that if you search Microglobal, it's part of their M series, and you can just click on a link and read it. And then there's also, in terms of staying in touch with A Rocha, you can listen to the Field Notes podcast that has a variety of guests from around or connected with the A Rocha worldwide family on lots of different topics. That's really interesting to listen to. And there's also like an e-news Field Notes version that has updates from the A Rocha family, and you can sign up to that on the A Rocha website. So please do go and do those things, give it a listen, and follow and get updates from A Rocha. But for now, I will stop, and I would love to invite your questions, and thank you for listening so attentively.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And if I could ask you to put your PowerPoint up just again, if you could, and take it to that last slide with Jonathan Moo. And while you're doing that, for those here, if you want to ask a question online, go to the reaction button and raise hand, which I've just done on my own. And if you could go back to the Jonathan Moo slide, I have a question. Get us going.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, so here's my question. All right, I really like Jonathan Moo, and what he's saying really speaks to me. But let me ask you a hard question. All right, start you off. You know, he says our lives even now ought to begin to be oriented toward creation in a way that is consistent with creation's eventual freedom from futility and ruin. So here's my hard question. You know, I love Genesis 2, but Genesis 1's a little hard, okay? Are you reading Genesis 1 as an anti-gospel? That we should maybe, like Thomas Jefferson, get some scissors out and cut it out as not really the good news of God? Or is there other ways that Genesis 1 could be read that would harmonize with what Jonathan's saying, or not? So what are your thoughts on that? What is Genesis 1 a mistake?
I am not saying that Genesis 1 is a mistake. I think in the big when I was going through that part of the talk, and I said Genesis 2 is a parallel account that adds detail. So I wasn't saying Genesis 2 shows that we should not read Genesis 1. Instead, I think we can, and I think one of the strengths as well about taking a kind of broad view across scripture is that you pick up a broader picture that helps you then go back to individual passages and think through what is being spoken about in that. And I would say that about Genesis 1, that it's it's really, sometimes we've read that and then just kind of lifted what we wanted to hear, because actually hearing that we were like, oh yeah, ruling over, that sounds good to me, I would like that, so it was easier than thinking through some of the implications of caring for creation as well.
I'm going to press you a little bit harder, Rachel, on that. Thank you. But how would you then, thinking of Genesis 2 and Genesis 1, how would you hold them together? What is it about Genesis 1 that would be revelation and good news?
Good pressing. I think what I would go towards is thinking about the roles that each, if you're thinking in terms of a wider community of creation, there's still a place for particular vocations within each of the elements of that community of creation. So in the sense that that chapter talks about us ruling over, there is a particular vocation that is entrusted to humans, and when done well, brings more of the goodness of God's creation out into its fullness.
That's a very good answer, and thank you. And that's what I wanted to draw out, because I think in that it really captures well, if you're going to try to hold in tension, but in good, how Genesis 1 may speak. So thank you, Rachel. Do we have any questions here that we want to ask? Rachel, here's just a second. This is Doreen from the Philippines.
Thank you for the presentation. I so agree with you that I think in my tradition, I'm Pentecostal, our inaction is due to our lack of lament. Because when I go to our Pentecostal churches and we see lots of corruption, like in the Philippines, all over the world, but we always tend to be celebrating all the time and not have a room for reflection and lament. And my question is, how can we move the emotion so that we can get our people to really think of creation care and, how to do something about the situation of the world?
Thank you for that
Have
question.
any practical suggestions?
Yeah, I think I'm going to actually, with many of these questions, just externally process some thoughts, so they might not always come out in a helpful order. But I think the first part that I think about is lament as breaking peace with the present. So if we are always celebrating and endorsing what is happening, then what it means is that we're not actually reckoning with the aspects of the present that are false peace. They're not really what God is wanting for us. So I think practically that means connecting, say within a congregational context, connecting with, oh, actually we are church in a local place, and really being aware of what is it within this local place that is hurting and broken and the sources of pain, and how are we being church in the context of that pain, and how are we moving towards it and not away from it. So I guess that's sort of a it's a negative view in one sense, because it's asking you to cause disruption and break peace. But then there's a positive aspect of that as well, which is saying that if we are accepting of what is happening at present, what is it about what God has for us that we're missing? Like if we are church within the context that we are church to, what are we failing to dream with God about the fullness of what God has? Like what would the more positive, what would it look like for this place to really hold the fullness of who God is? Like what would we love to see And then thinking through that side of it helps people to think, it's again a way of breaking peace in the sense of like, oh, there's more. So I think it's both a case therefore of identifying brokenness, but in a kind of, what do we see that is right here, right now, that we don't want to be happening, but also positively dreaming, what does God have in this place that would be better than where we are now, and breaking peace in that direction as well. And then I think bringing those two together helps. We should be content, but we should not be endorsing of something as the fullness of what God has if it is not the fullness of what God has for us. And sometimes our discontent can lead us towards a greater fullness of God.
Daniel, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rachel. That was a really excellent presentation. I love how you structured it, you know, moving the progression of the three trees and then looking at the issues of grief and lament and rage. And I think that whole aspect is so very important. And I hope some of the conversation continues in that direction. But that is out of my area of comfort and expertise. So I want to go back and pick up something that Tom was saying, because I think maybe I had a much more a different view of how you brought those things together than Tom did. And I was really impressed at the end that you took issue with the word stewardship and the word creation care, because I think you're absolutely right. Those are such nice words, and such you know, they're not controversial, and they're very good words actually. And yet there is something deeply missing, and I think you started to bring that out. So my question is, I didn't feel like you were, you know, trying to really dismiss Genesis 1 so much as to recognize what we have done with Genesis 1 in Christian history is we've completely misunderstood and misused and abused the words rule and the words subdue. And it's only when we look at, you know, Christ as king and God as the king, who we are his image bearers, and how does he rule? As King of Kings, he rules with sacrificial love, which you brought out in that one quote, you know, putting the interests of others ahead of oneself, and giving space for all to flourish. And that's a completely different kind of ruling. So my question for you is, you're involved in the, I'm in the theological side, so I'm trying to work with these words and meanings, but you're in the practical side. Can the word rule and image bearer and subduing be redeemed with the church today to bring out some of those different ways that we can be God's image bearers to creation? Or does it simply, you know, always end up with the damaging understandings of how we have ruled and how human beings do rule every time we get the chance to come into power, and you know, we rule with selfishness and with greed and with you know, self-interest and all the rest of it? Is there hope for redeeming those words?
I had a couple of different thoughts as you were speaking. One of the thoughts was that in some senses, language like, I don't know, stewardship wouldn't be such a vapid word to me if we didn't use it in such a vapid way. And equally, ruling would not be such a problematic word if the way we used it was in the light of the way that Jesus rules. So the question about how we take that language and then use it in a better way, in part, is less about the particular word that we use and more about the practice or understanding that goes with it. I think you're asking a secondary question there as well about what it would be like for us to rule in a Genesis 1 sense in this present context, when we are ruling in the sense of not having dominion in the way that we have up until this point, but using our ruling in a positive way. And I would love to see that happen, and for us to understand ruling to be leading with the authority of Jesus. And I think if we found more of what it is in our discipleship, to have the authority of Jesus, that idea of stewardship that at the moment can feel quite vapid would suddenly not be that vapid. But it would require a real wisdom and discernment within the context of our present injustices, of being able to name exactly what that injustice was. And I think that's what we're really struggling to do at the moment. And I think in part it's because what we are talking about is actually very political, and because we have in some ways felt safer to talk about the gospel from an anthropocentric perspective and talk about it as a personal acceptance of Jesus Christ as Saviour. In this sort of context, which demands that we kind of reclaim that broader scope, that actually we're saying, no, the destruction of the environment is wrong because it is, we believe that Jesus Christ is Lord over that environment, is actually really difficult for us to do. But I think that clarity of leadership with Jesus' authority would be what it would look like for that ruling to happen, and would be compatible with us using that word if we wanted to.
David, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Oh, yes, thank you. Fantastic. As you were speaking, I was just thinking about how we can prevent a theology of creation care or theologies of creation care from remaining on the margins of Christian theology. And how do we make sure that in the days to come, this theology and other theologies of creation care are fully integrated within what we see as the Christian theology? In OCMS, as you probably know, there is a lot of discussion on holistic mission. But I realize as I listen to lectures and seminars, there is very little discussion or thought on holistic theology, because our theology is largely seen as contextualized. So it's kind of relative to this, that, and the other context around the world. And the result of that is that it's often thought of as being fragmented, often also reductionist. So feminist theology, Dalit theology, Indian Christian theology, liberation theology. So there's very little integration in our thought. And I'm just wondering, going forward, such a thing should not happen to an important area of theologizing, which is to do with creation care. But I'm also thinking of this particular way of doing theology, I realize has an activist or advocacy angle to it. And I realize that fundamentally, there is a spiritual struggle that we need to be aware of, that all Christians need to wage as we push for reforms when it comes to governments, when it comes to relating with MNCs and market forces. I'm just wondering if you have come across any sort of new thinking in this area of theology of creation care that takes spiritual struggles seriously, struggles with the seen and the unseen world.
I don't think I have. Unfortunately, it's my short answer, and I would love to come across more or be able to give you some places to look. So if you're looking and you find places, please also get in touch with me and tell me what you're reading, because I'd really like to be part of that conversation as well.
Damon, please.
Yeah, I want to think a little bit more about the word rage or anger. So we know in the Old Testament that God can be angry on some evil things. In the episode of Jesus cleansing the temple, Jesus was also angry. Although we Christians are taught not to be angry too often, there is room for some anger, righteous anger, yeah? Theologians call them righteous anger. And there's a very interesting word in Mark chapter 1, verse 41. There Jesus was with this leper, and who begged Jesus to, well, he didn't say it explicitly, but he wants Jesus to heal him. I think he was so broken that he was not even able to ask Jesus to heal him, just in case Jesus reject him and he'll be hurt another time, you know? So he barely was able to come to Jesus and ask, well, and indicate to Jesus that he needs healing. And then Jesus was described as being, the two words used to describe his feeling. One is compassion. That's the normal translation that we have, the normal word that we have. But there are many manuscripts which also use the word angry. Angry. There are two different words. Some manuscript has compassion, some manuscript has angry. So I think we get the best of both worlds by combining them together. Jesus was angry. Such a person can be left in such a terrible state and, you know, chased out of the community and suffer. And he was angry at the state of affair of the community and of this individual. Very angry. But he was also compassionate for these persons. So I think it is his anger and his compassion which drove him to stretch out his hand to touch the leper, which what he was not supposed to do. He's unclean, you know, he's doing something wrong there in some people's mind. But never mind, you know, he broke the law in some sense. But it was the anger and the compassion which drove him to do something extraordinary and break the barriers, the ritual barriers. And I think sometimes it is good to be angry, but the anger must also be balanced by compassion. Angry on its own can be dangerous. Being radical on its own is good. I mean, it can be dangerous, but if it is combined with compassion, then we can go quite a long way to follow Jesus, I think. So it's not a question, it's a comment.
Thank you for the presentation. Mine is a contextual question. I think in July or August, there was the Lament conference. And in that conference, there was a debate about the same-sex marriage, for example. Because what interests me here is about creation and new creation. And when the debate was hot and people were thinking, there were different articles and there were different writings. Are these characteristics of new creation, or people are thinking of modernism? That's number one. Number two, I'm from an Anglican background where we value evangelism. And in most cases, youth in the church prefer to go the modern way, to have like a lively, church, other than a traditional church. And if you don't go by what is happening now, by the styles of life that are going on now, they don't go to the church. Should we refer to this as tradition versus modernism, or it is a way to a move to a new creation? Thank you so much.
I'm not sure if I understood that there was a question within that that you want me to respond to. I might need your help if you want me to respond.
Was it a question or a comment, Lubari?
There were two questions.
Yeah.
One, I gave a statement about the Lament conference, which was attended by the worldwide Anglican bishops. And there was a debate on the same-sex marriage, the global South versus the North. And in that debate, do you think it is an aspect of a new creation, or it is kind of a tradition versus modernism? That is question number one. Number two, I came from a background of a church that is more of evangelism, an Anglican church, and dealing with youth, for example, in the church. If there's no good music in the church, most youths do not attend that church because they need something which is of their interest. Is that kind of move or that kind of practice, is it kind of a new style of creation that they want to match to what is happening now? Or is again a tradition versus modernism? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure that I am best placed to answer those questions. I think the second one about youth and church and styles is often a generational preference question. I think the first one, questions about how we understand eschatology and life beyond death, and our understanding that marriage, for example, does not happen within the context of the new creation, should be, I'm sure, were informing some of the conversations that were happening there. But the specifics of the Lambeth conference and the conversations there are not something that I'm able to give any insight to.
Okay, thank you. Here, Emilita.
Rachel, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really an inspiring moment for me to listen. I like the idea of hope, that, grief, lament, and hope. At the same time, I was thinking about creation abuse and creation care. So if it is a triangle, creation abuse and then creation care and hope in the middle. I'm doing a research on the impact of loss of biodiversity, climate change, and ancestral land, and its impact to indigenous communities. And I'm finding that the loss of biodiversity, and especially the loss of forests, is impacting mostly women and children and leading to gender-based violence. So when you mention about brokenness, I can feel the sense of brokenness if you go into this group of people. I just wonder whether in your practice or in advocacy, whether you are also considering the impact of the loss of biodiversity and loss of, let's say, forest, and how you can also stretch the care into your, you call it community of creation, so that there is more, not just focus on the natural creation, but also the impact of the loss of these resources to people, and therefore make it more holistic. So I'm just interested to know whether you have stretched that hope to that group of people. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, in my case, I did a reverse engineer of this in the sense that I cared about the environment, firstly, because of the impact that it was having on other aspects of injustice. So you can talk about climate change and biodiversity loss as threat multipliers. So they multiply up other threats. There was an IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their report in 2018, which is a scientific report that compiles the science from across 30,000 scientific papers. And it looked particularly at the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees And that report said, quantified that difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of climate change as the difference between several 100 million people being susceptible to poverty. And it was that understanding of the human implications of vulnerable groups and the poor that first made me concerned about the environment. Since then, I have understood more of the intrinsic worth of wider creation and biodiversity on its own terms, even if that wider societal justice context did not exist. God would still be concerned for his creation to have the fullness of biodiversity that was created. So I'm not sure how much that answers your question, but what I am trying to convey is that I'm aware of that wider context of injustice, and in fact it was those kind of contexts and implications that have helped me better engage with the environment and biodiversity on its own terms, and not just in connection to those wider aspects.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm Levino. I come from a northeastern state in India. This is the first time I'm being exposed to academic and theological discussions on climate change. Of course, I hear about and I read about popular news on, whether there's climate change, how some people deny that there's climate change, and etc. But listening to your presentation and reflecting on this topic for some time now, I'm just trying to understand it from my perspective as a Christian coming from the global south. And within the discussion on this particular topic, where the poorer countries bear the brunt of climate change, as an activist and someone engaged with the movement in the West, what would you suggest is an appropriate position a Christian from one of these countries should take?
That's a good question. And I'm not necessarily sure that I'm best placed to advise. I think one thing to say is that the importance of stories and sharing perspectives is hugely important. Climate changes and environmental changes more broadly are often thought about as scientific topics, but the more interesting aspect about them is the real life dimensions and implications that the kind of scientific foundations have upon the real world. And I think people really long for and miss that human dimension. So I think being a Christian from North India, but present in other contexts, finding ways to share stories from different contexts that is a really effective way to start a conversation and to help people engage in a different way beyond the context that they're most used to. And I also think that getting connected with other Christians from different contexts who are part of doing this work is a really good way to build community and network with different people in these different spaces, because often people are looking for people to speak or get involved or talk about climate change from their perspective, but they don't know the people to ask. So for example, if you wanted to stay connected with me as you're thinking about how you want to do this within some of the contexts that you're in, I could then talk to you further about ways to do that, or be very happy to suggest contacts that would work.
Thank you, Rachel. And I want to echo what people say. Really good presentation. Thank you so much. And yeah, I said yes to every single thing that you mentioned in your presentation, which means that your talk can make sense to many people in this Western context. But on the other hand, I thought about people who are living in underdeveloped countries. where using fossil fuel is a kind of way of life, and it's a means of survival even during the winter time. So talking to them about creation care and stewardship is a kind of luxurious thing from my viewpoint at a certain degree. So my question is very similar to what Levina asked. Is it fair to them to say about creation care and stewardship without mentioning about economic injustice in this world? So that is the first question. And second one is, what is the best way that we can approach to Christians and churches in those underdeveloped countries to get more involved in Christian care and to become more better stewards of God's creation? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So the first question that you asked, we should absolutely not be talking about this without also talking about economic injustice. You talked about people's dependence on fossil fuels in those contexts. And I mean, basically in every context at the moment, people are dependent on fossil fuels. The people's consumption of fossil fuels is directly correlated to income. So you cannot separate this question from a question of economic injustice, because they are very, very, very closely tied together. And when we are talking about the misuse of creation, we are mostly talking to people living in a Western context, because it is these contexts that are most responsible for the situation that we are currently in. And even within the context, if you're talking with UK audiences, sometimes this comes up about being concerned that talking about the environment is a very kind of middle class concern that isn't relevant, or we can't address, or in some way, or being concerned that addressing this means not addressing issues of poverty. And that needs to be really challenged by bringing together an environmental and economic understanding of those things as part of the same sort of injustice. And if you want to kind of target who you're talking to, you target people who are in the highest income brackets, as where this conversation is going to be most challenging or relevant. Having said that, talking about your second question, and talking about Christians in churches in other contexts and how they should be engaging, I think that's a difficult question for me to answer. And what I don't want to do is say something that then gets applied in a way that isn't authentic to that particular context and place. I think the best way to think about it is in terms of if we are talking about the gospel and Christian belief in the terms of Jesus Christ as Lord of all creation, what does that mean to people in those particular countries and places? What are the injustices in environmental terms in those settings, and how are those churches interacting with it? I think it was maybe Doreen's question earlier about how in a Pentecostal context, about moving some of the emotions in the direction of lament and how to do that. And I think that would be what I would talk about here as well, is how do you bring an understanding within any church setting in whichever country that church is located in, that looks at the gospel and takes it holistically and then applies it to the setting that they are in, both culturally, economically, environmentally, and say from there, what is it that an understanding of the fullness of life in Jesus means for where we are now, and where do we go from there?
Well, thank you, Rachel, for an excellent presentation. Is my mic on? Yeah. And this will be available on YouTube, so that you can tie in. And again, Rachel, really good job too answering some hard questions, and you did an excellent job in that. And we do invite you to come visit OCMS sometime and speak in person. Our next lecture in the series, let's put our hands together for our next speaker will be Kuki Rokum, who is from New Delhi and works with the Evangelical Fellowship of India Commission on Relief. And she will be speaking on Whose World? Environmental and climate justice. So I think it'll attach into some of the things that you raised, Rachel, and some of the questions back and forth. And I think this just goes to show what an excellent series this is being put together. And with that as well, thanks to Daniel Button, who put this together and brought these excellent speakers together. So with that, we'll bid adieu for the day and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.